Hello, and welcome to another episode in our ongoing series on law in time of crisis. When this series began, the crisis of the title referred specifically to the healthcare crisis of the global pandemic brought about by the coronavirus. In recent days, however, that crisis has been overtaken by another one, a more recent and yet at the same time much older one of social and racial tension and unrest. And here to talk to us about that crisis and its relation to our healthcare crisis is Susan Herman, Centennial Professor of Law here at Brooklyn Law School. Susan is also the president of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And she is an expert on both constitutional law and criminal procedure, both of which are implicated in the conversation that we are about to have. So we are pleased and fortunate to have Professor Susan Herman with us for this conversation. So Susan, as I say, you are president of the ACLU, an organization with a 100-year history of dealing with civil rights and civil liberties issues, including issues around protest and the rights of individuals and groups to collectively protest the government. Maybe you can give us a brief sense of that history, the issues that have arisen and the ways in which the ACLU has helped address them.
Well, I think I would start with the fact that 1920, the year the ACLU was founded, was also a really extraordinary time where there were a lot of things happening that are just uncanny echoes of what's happening today. First, the country was still feeling the effects of the pandemic of 1918, which is sometimes mistakenly called the Spanish flu. In addition, the country was just emerging from World War I, where some of the things that had been going on during World War I were tremendous xenophobia, fear of foreigners, hatred of foreigners, and downright hostilities. As in addition to the idea that patriotism meant that you were never allowed to criticize the government for anything. So in the middle of World War I, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which prohibited speaking out against the government. And the Sedition Act was used to prosecute people for expressing views that were anti-war or anti-draft or against the government. So 1920, also another significant event that year, of course, was that the 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. So between 1917 and 1920, there were a lot of demonstrations at which women were trying to make their case that they should have the right to vote. And especially, there was one moment I found especially dramatic was that there were some women who were picketing the White House during World War I, because Woodrow Wilson was arguing that World War I involved the United States because we were making the world safe for democracy. And these suffragists were trying to point out that there's a certain hypocrisy in making the world safe for democracy when half of the people in the United States could not vote. Now, this was embarrassing to President Wilson. And two things happened at those demonstrations. One was that a lot of the demonstrators were being harassed and attacked by bystanders, and nobody was ever prosecuted or arrested for harassing the demonstrators. But hundreds of the women involved were arrested, and about 150 were jailed. Many were beaten simply for expressing views that were considered to be embarrassing. So you take all this repression of speech and assembly sort of across the board, no matter what the issue was. And that led the founders of the ACLU to think it was really time for an organization to start to defend civil liberties, no matter what the particular issue was. At a time when really the First Amendment was nothing but parchment. The courts did not think that it was their job to say people could not be prosecuted simply because they had expressed a controversial point of view. And then, of course, during all the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s, anti-war activists of the 1970s and beyond. But in addition to the question of whether you could have a protest, there were also a lot of issues about the techniques that police were using against demonstrators. We all have pictures in our mind, I'm sure, the shocking pictures of Southern law enforcement officials unleashing vicious dogs, partnering with the KKK, using the fire hoses against peaceful demonstrators. So I think I want to connect up the more brutal the policing of a demonstration, the more threatening the idea that the demonstrators are expressing to the status quo. But I think the good news from history is that mass public protest works. It can really galvanize public opinion. So after those women were picketing and demonstrating and lobbying and everything that they could think of doing, they got the vote in 1920. And the events on the bridge at Selma led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which for decades was a very effective way to equalize the vote. So I think today, the question is whether the aggressive policing is also something in some parts of the country, not everywhere, but whether it should say something to us about the status quo that's being threatened, and whether what we have now is an inflection point where we can really hope that the protests are going to spark greater attention both to the policing issues that were raised by George Floyd's murder, as well as to the structural inequality, which has been so clearly demonstrated by the impact of the pandemic on our essential workers, mostly on minorities.
It's not hard to see, given the history you describe, how the current moment is the latest variation on an established theme that has recurred over time with slight differences, but a lot of familiarity. At the same time, each time it recurs, there's a different particular context. Maybe you can say a few words about the particular issues you see with the state and federal and local responses that have arisen to the protests taking place right now.
Well, I think what's complicated this particular time is that we have the pandemic raging at the same time as we have this mass protest movement. And so, as I was saying before, I think you see a lot of very different pictures around the country, and some of them are very encouraging. There are places where the protesters are being welcomed by government officials and by law enforcement. There are places where law enforcement officials are joining the protesters to say, yes, we agree, we do need to be thinking about change. But of course, the things that we need to worry about more are the places where that's not happening. So, two different things about policing protests during the pandemic. Number one is that the First Amendment right to protest is not absolute. It doesn't mean you get to loot or burn down stores or attack police officers. It's a protection of peaceful protest. The people have the right to protest, but that doesn't mean that they can have exceptions from reasonable health measures, like wear a mask or social distancing, any more than they get exceptions from arson laws or theft laws or assault laws. You have to basically follow the law while you're protesting. And so in places where governments have ordered people to wear masks or be socially distanced, it is okay to impose those limitations. They're time, place, and manner limitations that, the kind that the First Amendment can allow, as long as they're neutral. What you can't have, and what has been a problem in some places in the country, is where government will allow a large religious assembly and not allow a demonstration. So if it's a health measure, if people can't be too close together, the government can't decide what's worth it and what isn't worth it. The government has to be content neutral. So what you see, the peculiarities of people wearing masks and so forth while demonstrating, aren't necessarily, First Amendment problems. There are certainly First Amendment tensions here. On the other hand, some of the police methods here that have been used to police in some places, again, not everyone, but we certainly have seen, as well as heard about, instances where the police have been using tear gas, shooting rubber bullets, sometimes apparently indiscriminately into crowds. A place in Brooklyn where a police vehicle drove into a crowd. So some of that is just, abusive, if it's not necessary. And I think not all the police are drawing a distinction between peaceful protesters and the small percentage who are looting. But in addition to just being inappropriate police conduct, I think there are places where the police conduct is exacerbating the health crisis. So one of the typical techniques of police control of a demonstration is they corral people, they herd them all together, and they make them all be in a small space. Now that just, that creates a greater likelihood of infection. Tear gas makes people cough. And when you cough, you expel droplets and you increase the likelihood of infection. Tear gas hurts people's lungs. None of us need to have our lungs hurt right now. So there are a number of ways in which I think those are serious problems. Plus, the other thing is that I think there's such incredible irony that there are police in this country who are using excessive force against people who are protesting the excessive use of police force. And to mention too, the other thing too that is kind of mirroring the exact problem that people are protesting is that the enforcement, the people who are being arrested during demonstrations are disproportionately people of color. In Minneapolis, 7 times as many Black people were arrested as white people.
Some grim ironies that you're identifying in this situation. And As you've mentioned, we have a pre-existing health crisis that has generated its own governmental interventions, some of which can be restrictive on our freedoms, like a stay-at-home order under which we've been living for some time. Now we have a set of concerns raised by these protests that have generated their own governmental interventions, such as curfews.
Right.
Is there a point at which the cumulative impact or combined impact of these crosses a line that they did not individually, or at what point should we become increasingly concerned about the extent to which all of these interventions are intruding on our lives?
So the courts have been having a very difficult time splicing the two areas of law, their First Amendment law and their health law. But it seems to me that a curfew, just looking at past law, curfews are not necessarily unconstitutional if they actually are necessary to protect people and their livelihoods. The problem is when a curfew starts becoming overbroad, it's broader than is needed for its reasonable, justification, or if the laws are vague, or again, if the laws are enforced in a discriminatory manner. Now, one of the concerns that we have about curfews, it's not just, kind of a First Amendment concern of people have the right to walk around, but the more opportunity, the more you invoke law enforcement and create new reasons for people to be arrested, the more, again, you're exacerbating the very problem that we've seen, which is that we have too much mass incarceration. It gives rise to the possibility for discriminatory enforcement. The mass incarceration is just, what we need to be fighting here. Plus, the other thing that the ACLU has been spending a tremendous amount of time on lately is that being sent to a jail or a prison or a detention facility these days could be a death sentence. If you are in detention, you're not going to have the ability to social distance. You're not going to have the ability to wash your hands whenever you want to. And I find this pretty shocking, but the only reason why most of the people in jail or prison in this country actually have personal protective equipment like masks is that they were given those thanks to Jay-Z and Meek Mill, a couple of rappers. It wasn't government. So to us, every time you start using the police to enforce health laws, protest laws, curfew laws, and every time you're arresting more and more people, you're not solving the problem, you're exacerbating the problem.
Of course, layered on to all of these existing issues and the concerns they raise and the various governmental interventions that have taken place, we're in an election year. So that also has implications not only for other liberties, but for our right to vote. What issues do you see with respect to voting rights as we approach the election?
Oh, tremendous issues. I think what we just saw around the election in Wisconsin is really a cautionary tale, where there was a political infighting in Wisconsin about whether or not the primary would be postponed, which the governor wanted to do, but in fact the courts didn't allow. And people lined up for blocks in Wisconsin to vote, and there were fewer polling places because of the pandemic. So the governor wanted people to be able to vote by mail, and there ended up being a skirmish about whether or not you could vote, but whether or not there would be additional amount of time allowed to count the absentee ballots. Now, I think the bottom line that everybody has to know is that the studies show that people got sick voting in Wisconsin. They became infected while they were waiting to vote. And if you're in an indoor area and closed with other people, and if that's happening, that is pretty likely to happen. So I think that where we are right now is that we have to start thinking about alternative ways of voting that can keep people safe. Voting by mail has to be on the table. It has to be a possibility. But we are already running out of time to make that happen because it takes an incredible amount of preparation as well as money to convert states where that has not been done on a large scale so that they're going to be able to do it and do it reliably. The Texas Supreme Court also just held that the Texas law, which says you can get an absentee ballot if you have a disability, they've said, well, that doesn't apply if we're only talking about whether you're susceptible to infection. So I think, again, we have pre-existing law that we have to adapt here. So in addition to the how are people going to vote, which, again, we have to start thinking about that now. There are issues about registration. How can people register? Can we make that easier? And of course, we have a political battle about who wants to encourage people to vote and who doesn't. We have continuing problems with all the voter ID laws, the laws that are just intended to place obstacles and purges. So what I'd like to say to the audience out there, to law students and lawyers and alums, is that there's really nothing you could do more important for democracy right now than to try to make sure that people who want to vote are able to. Let's get behind having better methodology and having the resources that we need. There's nothing more important than we can do to them to make sure that our election, in fact, is representative of what people want to vote, instead of the vagaries of who happens to be ill and where you happen to live and how quickly the state is trying to discourage people from voting.
To change gears just a little bit, we've had the opportunity a few times in this series to talk about how our curriculum and the classroom experience is informed both by the expertise of the faculty members who are teaching and by current events that are shaping the world around us. And a perfect example of that is reflected in your own teaching schedule for the upcoming year, since you'll be teaching a course in COVID-19 and the Constitution. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you expect that course will involve.
Right. Well, I was suddenly looking at my lineup for the fall, and I was thinking, well, why should we be talking about issues of the past when we have so many constitutional law issues of the future? So I'm spending time now every day gathering materials, including in some of the areas we've talked about today, the tensions between reasonable health measures and the First Amendment, or due process, or how do you have a jury trial? Yeah, how does a jury get together? What happens with all those people in detention, and who gets to decide? Is it the governors or the courts, who are stepping in and making things happen? So to me, this is just like an advanced constitutional law course. In addition, other kinds of issues about who gets to decide, the constitutional structural issues. We've heard the president and the attorney general sporadically say that they get to order the rest of the country and tell everyone what to do. Well, historically, starting with the 1918 pandemic, that's not true. The governors were the people who ordered what to do. So, where do you use the military? So I think there's so many issues, and I'm assuming that there are going to be some students who are going to want to talk about the impact of all these current events on our Constitution and our law.
I don't think there will be any shortage of student interest, nor do I think there will be any shortage of alumni jealousy on the part of people who wish they were still around to be able to take this class here at the law school, since it touches on so many things of importance to all of our lives. Thank you so much, Professor Susan Herman, for sharing your insights into these issues with us. Thanks to everyone for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again for future episodes of Law in Time of Crisis.